5 chilling, true camping stories. In some of these stories, it seems I'll be playing a female, just an FYI. That's Not a Fox, by Sheila for the win. November last year, me and my friend decided to drive my car up to Scotland to do some fishing and, eventually, make our way to Edinburgh. After the first day of catching some salmon and brown trout, we stored our catches in a cooler box after contemplating whether to sleep in the car tonight, as we had left it quite late to set up camp, almost 4:30ish. The sun was going down. Eventually, I said, let's set up a fire and cook the fish. I didn't drive all the way to Scotland to sleep in the car. My friend agreed, as we set off, looking for a spot to camp. We found a little wooded area next to a car park near a farm. We looked into it prior, and apparently, you can basically camp anywhere in Scotland as long as you left the place as you found it. So we grabbed all our shit out the car and started setting up our campsite. 20 minutes later, we have a fire going, 2 fold-up chairs, and 2 tents up. My tent was out of view from my friends. This'll be relevant later. We were glad we chose to camp out instead of sleep in the car. As we smoked a few joints, we reminisced about school life, etc. My friend struggled to keep his eyes open as I checked my phone. 2 a.m. He called it a night, crawling into his tent and zipping it shut. I sat there with my feet up on my friend's new empty seat, listening to the sounds of the wildlife. I shut off the torch we'd hung up on a tree next to us, leaving me in darkness apart from the burning embers from the coal. It must have been 3 or so minutes before I started to hear the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs that seemed to be coming toward me. Being quite a rational person, I passed it off as a fox drawn to the scraps of food we may have left lying around. I was quickly proven wrong when I heard a sniffle, like someone with a cold clearing their nose. My high quickly turned from chilled out to paranoia as I feel a heavy dread come over me. My mind raced. Why the fuck is someone out here in the woods at 2 to 3 a.m? Why are they coming towards me? I slowly reached down to my pocket and felt my heart drop as I didn't feel the smooth blade of my pocket knife. Shit, I must have left it in my tent. All the while, I hear the treading coming closer and closer, my heartbeat racing. Out of the darkness, I see a middle-aged man, clean-shaven, parted hair around 5'10", slowly creeping towards me, almost on all fours, like a predator trying to stay out of sight. I sat there, paralyzed, unable to speak. My mouth was that dry, I could hardly swallow. That's when I realized he hadn't even seen me. Being under a tree with no light source, I must have blended in. Also, with there only being one tent in view, I guess he thought my friend was the only one camping here. He got closer to the tent and half breathed and half whispered, "Come on, do it," in a raspy voice. Creeped the fuck out and unable to bear the thought of what he'd do next, I said, "Oi, can I help you?" He jumped up in shock and his whole demeanor changed. He looked at me, mumbling awkwardly as he scurried back out of the woods. I sat there, still trying to comprehend what happened, when I saw the headlights of a car turn on and drive away. I woke my friend, and he could tell how shook up I was, so without a full explanation from me, he willingly grabbed all our gear, and we slept in the car that night, with the doors locked. 1 Week Camping by Nirasil. When I was 19, I was a venture scout, sort of like Boy Scouts, only for older kids and it's gender mixed. I decided to go to this week-long mixed scouting crew camping trip with a friend of mine, but a few days before going, my friend from Venture Scouts bailed, so I'd be going into the mountains alone with a bunch of strangers, which was no big deal. I can handle myself. When I got there, I was the only Venture Scout and the only girl. It was a little awkward, but most of the Boy Scouts were pretty nice and easy to get along with. Although they weren't used to camping with a girl, they happily accepted me as just one of the guys. But there was this one guy, Danny. From the first day of camp, he wouldn't take his eyes off me. He'd just stare at me. It was a little uncomfortable, yeah, but I figured he was just socially inept with girls or something, and tried to pay him no mind. The next day, while we were hiking, we split off into pairs, and it turned out I was paired with Danny. He looked a little too excited about the idea of hiking with me alone. His eyes always seemed a little too wide, a bit crazed looking, but he was a small guy, spindly, unkempt hair, and a little shorter than I was at 5'7". I figured I'd be able to take him on in a fight if he tried anything, so I didn't raise a fuss about it. Before setting out to the hike, he kept asking me if I needed help putting on my sunscreen. Even though I kept declining, he kept pushing the question and trying to put sunscreen on me until one of the guys told him to cut it out. While we were hiking together, he kept probing me. "How old are you?" he'd ask. 19, almost 20, I'd reply. "Oh, don't lie. You must be 14 or something. You're so innocent. Young, innocent girls are always the cutest." He kept asking innocent enough questions like where I lived, if I had siblings, what my favorite color was. But he then started asking me if I'd ever heard of BDSM. I was taken aback by this and was more than a little uncomfortable, so I pretended to not know what he was talking about, all while trying to give as many cues as possible for him to drop the subject. But he then started going on about what BDSM was, about tying girls up, about hitting them and burning them. At this point, I was freaking out a little bit, but keeping my cool. I didn't want to show him my distress, any chinks in my armor, as I knew he'd probably get off on making me squirm. The only thought I could think was, what the fuck? Seriously, what the fuck? As I kept my eyes fixed to the path ahead of me. Then, he started complimenting my skin. "You don't see a lot of girls with pale skin. Do you use moisturizer?" he'd ask, attempting to touch my hand, but I kept my arms close to me, held fast to my backpack. I was incredibly tense, and every muscle in my body was screaming. I sorely regretted wearing a tank top as I could feel his eyes on me. He started telling me how pale skin is beautiful since you can see rope burns and the bruises better. The way he said it sent chills down my spine, and the anxious knots forming in my stomach grew tighter. He asked me if I was a virgin. Then he asked me if I fantasized about rape and if I'd like to try out rape play. Wide-eyed in disbelief, I turned my gaze away from the dirt path and looked at him. He was smiling, a creepy, childish sort of smile that was just chilling. I kept silent and quickened my pace. He felt too close, far too close. I wanted to run. He could probably see the fear in me at this point. There was no hiding it. But then, I saw that another pair of scouts were ahead of us. I ran to them, telling them that the four of us should group up and go together. At first, they declined, saying that we're supposed to be going in groups of 2, but upon seeing how panicked and distressed I was, the 2 guys changed their minds, looking confusedly at Danny, who was silently glaring at them. I was just glad someone else, other than Danny, was there. The 4 of us went up the mountain, and I tried to keep close to the other 2 boys and as far from Danny as possible. Upon reaching the end of the trail and regrouping with the others, the 2 Boy Scouts offered to switch partners to descend the mountain path. Danny looked downright upset, angry even. He was looking at me as if he were betrayed, but I didn't care if it pissed him off. I accepted the offer of switching partners and was able to get back to camp in relative peace. On the way down, the Boy Scout I was with asked me if Danny was bothering me or something, but I lied and said he wasn't bothering me too much. After all, I was 19. I thought it would be pathetic to get so distressed about some weird 15-year-old kid. I figured that, so long as I stuck with the other guys, I'd be fine. But then, that night, I was alone in my tent. Everyone else got to sleep in pairs of 2 or 3, but since I was the only girl, I had to be alone in my tent. It's always a little creepy being alone and isolated in the forest, away from everyone else. The scoutmasters insisted my tent be far away from the boys' tents so that they wouldn't bother me, but it only put me in a more vulnerable, isolated position. I sorely wished I'd been closer to the protection of the rest of the group. Late at night, I heard rustling outside. I figured it was just a deer or elk or something, as it usually was, and went back to sleep. But then, I heard my tent opening. Opening my eyes, I peeked through the crack in my sleeping bag to see what it was. And there, I saw the white of an eye looking back at me, looking through the opening of my small tent. It was Danny, staring at me. I froze, holding my breath. I held my dad's hunting knife close to me, hiding in my sleeping bag, not moving a muscle, staring Danny down, pretending to be asleep, ready to fight at any moment should he take one step into my tent. But he didn't do anything. He just stared, watching me, breathing heavily and muttering incoherently to himself. "Are you there?" I thought I could hear him say. Eventually, after what felt like an hour, he left. The next morning, exhausted, I caught naps when, and if I could, and kept close to the other scouts in my group. It was difficult to maintain my calm and cool composure. The scout leaders were a little frustrated with me since it seemed like I wasn't paying much attention to their instructions, but at this point, I didn't care much for it. I was always on some level of alert, as Danny would sometimes creep up behind me and caress my neck or play with and try and smell my hair. And every night, Danny was there, watching. One night, he went digging through my backpack, looking for something, but unfortunately for him, I kept all my clothes and personals tucked away with me in my sleeping bag. He left with nothing. I grew up in rough situations and circumstances, so I always felt I can only really rely on myself. Asking for help was never an option as a kid. Asking for help meant you're weak, so it hardly even occurred to me. I was prepared to tough it out the rest of the week. But a little over halfway through the week, Danny was called away by the scoutmasters and sent home. I got the feeling that the Boy Scouts that helped me before saw what he was doing and sent in a complaint about him to the staff, as, while everyone else was confused and happily saying bye, he just crossed his arms firmly and stared as Danny left. Danny looked so bewildered and confused by it all, like he didn't understand what he did to deserve being kicked out of the camp. It was so strange. I tried my best to forget about it, and the rest of the week went off without a hitch. But the more I think back on it, the more I realize how damn freaky and bizarre that kid really was. I fear he may end up being some kind of serial rapist or something when he grows up. But all I know for certain is that he was very disturbed. I'm just glad my dad told me, although knives weren't allowed at this camp, to take his hunting knife in with me. My father insisted I keep it for protection, and I didn't regret it. Strange Mountain Man by Phil Coleman. St. Patrick's Day is a crazy occasion in most cities, and my hometown of Dublin is no exception. Last week, I found myself with a few days off on either side of our national holiday, and so decided to get away from the madness of the city and spend some time camping and hiking in the nearby mountains. On the eve of my trip, my buddy called to tell me he was sick and wouldn't be joining on the adventure. Who needs him? I thought, and decided to make the trip alone. The weather was beautiful, and I spent a very enjoyable St. Patrick's Day hiking through the woods and mountains above Dublin alongside a good number of similar-minded folks. At roughly 4 p.m, I spotted a nice thicket of trees in the distance and made my way towards what looked like a perfect campsite. I found a clearing, set up my shelter, and prepared a delicious dinner before settling down with a book and the sounds of the wilderness for company. At 7 p.m, something changed. I suddenly became very uncomfortable and agitated. There was someone nearby. Somehow, I just knew it. It was completely dark. I scanned the surrounding woods with my torch, but could see nothing out of the ordinary. It was just me and the trees. Settle down, I told myself. It's natural to feel a bit scared when you're alone in the woods. But no matter how much I tried to clear my mind, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that the situation just wasn't right. I knew that the last bus left the nearest village at 10:30 p.m, and that I was roughly 3 hours away by foot. In the heat of the moment, I decided to get the hell out of there and take my chances on the trail. I packed my gear in record time and moved out, stumbling over fallen trees in the thick gorse until I hit the trail. I was in a panic, but comforted by the well-trodden path. A half an hour of gentle descent and I'd be on a paved road, and after that, it was only an hour to the well-frequented regional road that led to the village. After only a few hundred meters, however, I was stopped in my tracks. Sitting on a tree stump just off to the side of the trail sat a lone figure. By the light of my headlamp, I saw that it was a man dressed in dark, street clothes rather than the bright hiking gear one might expect. I was instantly on edge. There was no point in trying to hide, as he had no doubt already seen me with my headlamp and reflective jacket. We drew closer in the darkness, and I saw that he was roughly in his 30s. As I passed, he looked at me, smiled, and said, "Lovely evening." Yeah, it is. I said something like that anyway. It was probably more of a mumble. I continued forward, on my guard. After a minute or two, I turned to look behind me and saw no sign of the man I'd just passed. There was a house a kilometer or so in the distance, and I thought the best thing to do would be to stop there for directions to the village road. Several minutes later, I again felt a pang of uneasiness and checked the path behind me, only to see the figure once again, this time on foot, heading the same direction as me. I hurried toward the house. I felt much more relaxed once I reached the warm glow of the cottage. I got directions from a nice elderly couple and was pleased to learn the road was just a small distance away at the bottom of their driveway. With no sign of the mountain man behind me, I walked on. Just as I reached the road, I heard a banging noise from the direction of the house, followed by an out-of-breath yet familiar voice. "I've been separated from my friend. Did he come this way?" Without thinking, I scrambled up the embankment at the side of the road and concealed myself as best I could, one hand on my camping knife. My heart has never beat so fast. I couldn't hear the householder's reply, just the sound of the door closing, followed by footsteps on the gravel driveway. I saw the man, silhouetted by the moonlight, walk into the road and peer into the distance in either direction before hurrying off in the opposite direction of the village. I waited in the hedgerow for, I suppose, 15 or 20 minutes, terrified, before plucking up the courage to continue my walk to civilization. I trudged on for over an hour before I heard the rumble of a car engine in the distance and saw its headlights approach. I stuck out my thumb, and to my surprise, the driver stopped. I asked if he could give me a ride into the village, and he said no problem. Once in the car, the driver, a friendly Polish man, asked if I was looking for my friend. Friends? No, I was out hiking alone and I just lost track of time. I lied, not wanting to admit I got scared camping alone. Oh, I only asked because I was just flagged down by another young man who told me he was looking for his friends, and you fit his description perfectly. He seemed very agitated. In shock, I told the driver about my encounter with the mountain man and how he had headed in the opposite direction over an hour ago. Well, he must have turned around because he stopped me only a few hundred meters behind the spot where I picked you up. 5 minutes later, I was back in the well-lit, well-populated village. I made it in time for the bus and, within the hour, was back in Dublin city centre. I have no idea what was going on with that man, or what he intended to do if he caught up to me. I'm just glad I followed my gut and was lucky enough to make it home with nothing more than an odd story. And a big thank you to Darius for the lift. The Whistler, by Not One More Word Tonight. A couple of years ago, I was stressed out from college and big city life and decided to spend a long weekend in the woods doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy, and us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods-free camping in the winter, alone. While this sounds like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you're an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warrioress my dad always hoped I'd be. I always hated the feeling of claustrophobia that came with being female in the city, avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone out in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom. Or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the roads, the surroundings getting wilder and wilder as I drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch, and with a compass and a map, hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in a clearing with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a couple of beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twittering of birds and the very distant rumblings of the half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I came out at the exact place I had intended to. I punched a hole in the thin crust of ice and set to getting my fish on. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fishes be hungry and shit. I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to just clean the fish here and now and take it straight back to camp to cook. I quickly realized my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral senses was irritating me, but I was very set in my task, focusing on the motions in the slippery mess. The thing in the periphery was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I carved and hacked and sliced my hand open freshly as the fish slipped out of my hands and into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "Fuck off with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed, and then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I'd grown so accustomed to white noise that I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate the sound was in this context. The silence weighed down on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt, and no hunter would give himself away like that. And if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst, yelled something vulgar back, apologized? No, nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods, silence as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twitterings of a bird or something, I just decided the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder, and headed for camp. I trudged off in the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Apprehensive but drawn, like a moth to the flame, I trudged up to what materialized in the closing distance as a moose kill. A very, very good moose kill. A clean shot for the upturned eye, staring at me and saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread I couldn't translate. I ran hard, and I ran fast. In the snow and the woods, everything looked the same. I knew I was moving south, and I knew I'd passed camp on the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a weary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of the woods clearing ahead to make way for the country roadway. I looked to my left and saw my car 50 yards or so down, jogged to it, and drove the lonely 15 miles to the first motel I saw signs for. I had none of my belongings and no earthly idea why I'd just abandoned ship like that. It was only as I was sitting up, watching the infomercials that night, that it started to fall together. Why would the park service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they allowed hunting? The moose defied everything of my rudimentary understanding of hunting. Even with the snow to cool it, decomp starts quickly on an animal that size. You'd have time for a few quick pictures, but you'd want to have it dressed quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How could you even drag it back to the road? In the morning, in a sleep-deprived and paranoid state, I described everything I'd seen and thought I heard to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more vexed about illegal hunting than any of my crazy city girl ramblings. He said he wanted to come pick me up and have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I said I was only going if he brought a gun. He sighed with exasperation and told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding in the back, as if on the back of the world's awkwardest motorcycle. We got to the large impression in the snow where the moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distinct track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail in the snow, as if the carcass were on a tarp. The ranger said he should take me back now. He asked where my camp was. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. It looked like he was finally sharing in my unease. Back at the hotel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped to make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He said darkly, "You don't want them back. They're covered in moose mess." So, what happens now? Well, miss, we're just gonna keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard of or seen anything like this ever before. I'm really sorry this happened. And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I've tried every different application of reason. A hunter who needed help, but knew I was already gone. A deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill. One of the few friends I shared this story with envisioned him as some deep woods Sweeney Todd. He dubbed him Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear the gunshot. The whistling seems so vivid in my memory, but was it even real? One question has been definitely answered. I'll never go into the woods alone again. My story about camping in the Appalachians by Sixstring Shadows. A few years back, my girlfriends and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It's about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to to Petersburg in Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you are supposed to camp on the trail or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore these suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A little searching around, and we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me awake and telling me, "Get your gun, someone's outside, walking around our tent." She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside our tent, running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and then we sat silently, listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Snap, crunch, snap. Someone, or something, walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away, so as to not give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, snap, crunch, crack. It sounded like it was bipedal, based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away, and that I was armed. I kept the flashlight on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like someone running away for the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then, from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I am giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning, I looked around a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft, moist dirt not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out, as it confirms that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out to them, something along the lines of, "We are armed! Get the fuck out of here!" They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby, and I walked to the edge where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could, and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night, talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anyone and quite literally on our own. Since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we had been out there, I really felt we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step out onto the trail and just stand there, watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a sec and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there, silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car. Extremely exhausted, we made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic, inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone just messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I'll never know, because I'll never be returning to find out.